Okay, we are ranking the Incantations again. Last time it was before the DLC. This time with the DLC, with all this new and improved stuff, all these different types of buffs and nerfs, and there's 129 to cover. Now, just like from my original Incantation ranking video, yes, this is just going to be for PvE, and yes, I actually did play through every single individual spell type and did my own playthroughs with them. But yeah, it's going to be a longer one, so might as well just get right into it. Starting off at the bottom, Watchful Spirit, which is a slow-moving holy projectile attack that works kind of similar to the phalanx spells that the sorceries have. Then you don't have to aim it, or you have to do is lock onto an enemy and they'll just track by themselves. But the difference being is that this one sucks. It does terrible damage. It fires off one projectile after the other in a very slow animation. The casting animation is really slow, but yeah, the damage just sucks, so there's no point of using it. 128 Law of Causality, which is a holy AoE attack that actually does serve as somewhat of a unique buff in that when you do get hit 5 times, it will result in this explosion attack. Now you can't just use this AoE explosion on demand, you have to get damage first, which is obviously a downside because especially in this game, you're going to be taking a lot of damage from a lot of different bosses and enemies, and the AoE explosion is just definitely not that good to compensate. The damage is awful. It does like send smaller enemies flying, so maybe if you're surrounded by a bunch of trash mobs, it might be somewhat useful, but it's just not worth the FP cost. You have to spec into intelligence as well as faith. And there might be like some uses with like a shield that doesn't get 100% physical block, but I would just never really want to build around that because 100% physical block shields are just really good to have. 127 Divine Bird Feathers, which this spell is a big giant waste of FP, as it does shoot out this horizontal spread of holy based feathers that do next to no damage and just drain your entire FP bar in a few seconds. So yeah, it's kind of similar to like the Fire Surge spell, but this one is arguably worse because it has a longer starting up animation and does holy damage as well. 126 Order Healing, which does alleviate Death Blight buildup, which is very niche in this game because there's not really many instances to where there are Death Blights going around, and even if there is, and if you died to it, honestly, you kind of deserve it because it doesn't really build up that quickly. Maybe in some of the dungeons in the DLC to where this might be something that you want to have on, but there's so many different types of talismans and consumables that can actually help resist this particular status effect that it makes this spell itself kind of useless. 125 Midra's Flame of Frenzy, which is an absolute major disappointment because this thing, kind of like Divine Bird Feathers, is the big giant waste of FP in that it shoots out this frenzy-based attack that actually does cover this nice amount of range, but it does terrible damage and your entire FP bar is gone in an instant, and also it's going to be proccing madness upon yourself, and it could do it faster than basically any other spell in the game, so it's arguably worse than something like Divine Bird Feathers, but at least it can do like some amount of damage. But if you did want to have some frenzied flame-based AoE attack, things like Flame of Frenzy or Unendurable Frenzy are going to be infinitely better. 124 Fire's Deadly Sin. Now this spell actually does coach the player character in this big giant fire to when you actually stand next to enemies that makes them take a little bit of damage over time, but in return you also take a little bit of damage over time, and in most cases you're going to be having less health, so it's just a big downside more so than anything, especially because you're not always going to be right next to an enemy or a boss to benefit. Now I know some people like to pair this alongside some Frost Fire builds because the fire of this attack can actually just reset the frost and you can keep re-proccing it again. Now the thing is, Frost Fire builds are just awful, and they're just like a complete worse version than bleed based builds because the whole benefit of Frost is that it debuffs enemies to make them take 20% more damage over 30 seconds. So using fire based sources removes the debuff, just making Frost almost useless because it does like less damage than bleed, and it's going to take even longer to proc the next time, and this type of playstyle is just not good at all. It might be fun to some people, it definitely is viable in some cases, but it's not optimal by any means. 123 Vike's Dragon Bolt, which is a weapon buff, body buff, 2-in-1. The weapon buff portion is identical to Electrify Armament, which actually is a pretty decent damaging lightning buff. Only difference being is that this one is red, which obviously is really cool. Now, as for the body buff, this one just kind of sucks, because it makes you take roughly 30% more lightning damage, but it only increases your equipment load by 15%, which getting an equipment load increase for a short duration is borderline useless because you're not going to really be playing around like a fat roll and then use this spell to go to medium roll. You're just going to have your character already at this medium load to begin with. So this type of buff is just a more so as a debuff than anything. Now you could just go ahead and use this spell and then slap on things like Flame Gaming Strength to remove the body buff and then just actually gain the cool weapon buff, but being that this thing actually consumes more FP than Electrify Armament, there's no real reason to use this outside of the fact that you just think it looks cool. 122 Electrocharge, which this spell does surround your player character with this lightning-based AoE attack, and when enemies are nearby you, they will take a little bit of damage over time, which is similar to Fire's Deadly Sin. This is just a lightning-based version. Now, Fire's Deadly Sin does do a bit more damage, but I'm still going to value this one more because at least it doesn't drain your own health as well. But the reason why it sucks is because, once again, the damage is terrible. It doesn't do any stance damage, so you can't stop enemies from regenerating their poise. And worst of all yet, it's like straining to your eyes. It's like constant flashing on your screen, and it just gets annoying. 121 Elden Stars. For a 50 faith requirement, 2 whole slots, and 41 FP cost, you do a whole bunch of nothing. It summons out this holy based tracking projectile attack that does next to no damage, and the only thing that it actually manages to do is waste your time and your FP. Number 120, we have Litany of Proper Death, which this is a holy based AoE attack, and its only purpose is to kill skeletons quickly, as it does do bonus damage to undead enemies. So yeah, we have a whole dedicated spell just to be able to kill skeletons a little bit faster, to where there's already like a bunch of different buffs in this game that can do bonus damage to skeletons, and they're not really that challenging of an enemy to begin with. So yeah, this thing just kind of sucks. Number 119, Urgent Heal. Now, this spell is not really that urgent, and it doesn't really heal you for that much. So, yeah, no. Number 118, Surge O Flame, and you can put this bad boy in the same category as all the other ones that just do nothing but waste your FP for no damage in return. Because yeah, Surge O Flame, you can just continuously hold onto it to do a bunch of fire damage, but for the amount of ticks that it actually does do for damage, it consumes like 3 times as much more FP, and I don't know why that's the case. I'm not sure if it's always been this way and it's always been bugged, but like it feels like it should be doing like 2 to 3 times more damage, and it just doesn't. So yeah, this thing, at least it's quick, but I don't really value it at all. 117, Law of Regression, which this spell does heal you from all status effects, but for a 55 FP cost and 37 intelligence requirements for an incantation, it is not worth it. It does have its uses in PvP, but obviously this is a PvE list, so yeah, I don't really care for this thing at all. Number 116, Poison Armament, which is a poison damaging weapon buff. Does nothing but just add a little bit of poison buildup, no damage at all, and the poison status effect is just not that good, as it only does roughly 6% damage over a minute 30, which for comparison, Scarlet Rot can do anywhere between 15 to 30% damage over a minute 30, so this thing is just not going to be that good. And if you wanted to proc poison, you have the Poisonous Mist spell, which has just as low as a faith requirements, but can proc poison a lot quicker, and you can just stave up your weapon and buff it with something else, and that's more useful. Number 115, Dragon Bolt of Florisax, which this is an aura buff that does boost your damage negation by 10% and your guarded damage negation by 20%, which the guarded damage negation part is only really going to be useful for elemental damage, because with most cases when you have a shield, you're probably going to have a 100% physical damage negation shield, unless you're going to be going with the thrusting shields, to where this thing might be somewhat useful, but the thing is it has to compete with Golden Vow, which also does boost your damage negation by 10%, but gives you 15% more damage, which I'm just going to find way more useful, unless you are going to go with like a primarily shield-based build. But the thing is, for a 52 faith requirement, it's just not that useful. If this thing only had like a 10 or a 15 faith requirement, I would easily slide this thing into the B tier, because you could use it with every single shield type of build, but it's just meant for a pure faith build. 114, Inescapable Frenzy, which is a grab attack that does this proc a little bit of madness build up over time. Now the thing is, this works on basically no enemies in PvE, unlike things like Lifesteal Fist. At least that actually works against some smaller types of enemies, but yeah, this thing is just meant for NPCs and in PvP, and even against NPCs, it's fun to use, but it's not going to be that viable because you get no hyper armor, and even the damage isn't really that great. There are much better things and spells out there that could just melt NPCs really quickly, but this thing can be pretty cool. 113, Spira, which this is a wholly damaging projectile attack that actually does have the AoE spawn directly under the enemy, but even if the enemy is like the slightest bit mobile, it's going to miss every single time, and for over a 40 faith requirements, 2 whole slots, and 10 FP for every single cast. That means for like a few seconds, you're draining like almost half your entire FP bar in some cases, and your reward at best is very mediocre damage. 112, Death Lightning, which is a high damaging lightning based AoE attack, also does leave this Death Blight cloud on the ground, which in PvE basically useless. Even in PvP it doesn't really have many uses anyway, but the thing is, the reason why I'm not going to value it is because the keyword that I used was hitting. This thing doesn't really do that very well. The hit detection is terrible, awful tracking. The RNG spread upon all those lightning pillars are just awful, and obviously this thing has to compete with Ancient Dragon's Lightning Strike, and it's never going to win because Ancient Dragon's Lightning Strike has less RNG spread, it actually goes a lot further, it does way more damage, and it also only takes up 1 spell slot while having cheaper faith requirement too. 111 rejection. This thing is meant to like just send enemies flying to the ground or knock enemies off ledges. More of a PvP thing because yeah, in PvE, basically not really worth using because it does no damage. 110 cure poison, which poison as a status effect, as I mentioned earlier, does basically next to no damage, and there aren't really many instances where you are going to get procced with poison, and if I did, I wouldn't really care, just ignore it for the most part, because it's going to do like roughly 6% of your health bar over like almost 2 minutes, and also there's like thousands of other different types of like incantations or buffs in this game that can actually help kill you with poison anyway. 109 Flame Sling, which is just a basic fire-based projectile attack. Doesn't do that good at damage at all, and the whole purpose of it is just to be meant as like an early game option, so it could inevitably be outclassed by something else, and in this instance, things like Black Flame or Flame Fall Upon them, that is going to be a lot better, and also for some of them, you can actually get them early on the game anyway, so yeah, there's not really much of a point. 108 Aspect of the Crucible Breath, which in my opinion is the worst out of all the Crucible spells. Now the way this spell was kind of designed in my opinion was like something like the Dragon Breath spells, but this is just like a smaller version of that does have like somewhat of a wider AoE, but the thing is, it just does not do good damage at all, and unlike the dragon spells, it doesn't really go that far, but like the dragon spells, it has a very long animation that gets you no hyper armor, and in this instance too, it involves you having to walk forward constantly, like you don't really have much directional control, and sometimes it could just be more of a downside that you're just constantly walking forward. Like it can stun lock some certain types of enemies, but the damage output is just not there, especially for how much FP it actually consumes. Now getting into this C tier, this is going to consist of stuff that's pretty bad, but not entirely shit, like it has a niche use, but that niche use is not completely trash. But at 107, we have Shadow Bait, which this thing does shoot out this decoy projectile attack that has some smaller types of enemies get aggroed on towards it. So it's kind of meant for like some stealth-based types of combat and playstyle, but there are going to be much better different types of stealth-based skills out there that are going to perform a lot better for this particular type of build. But for something like Shadow Bait, it can be useful if enemies are already aggroed on towards you, because stealth-based spells or skills aren't going to be useful in these circumstances. But I think something like Darkness Spell could probably outclass this anyway, but at least it's pretty cheap. 106 Minor Erdtree, which does summon this little tree that does give you some healing over time as well as your allies if you are standing nearby it, and it does roughly equates to 35 HP per second, but it does only last 30 seconds, so it's going to give you just a bit over 1,000 of your health back, which can be okay, but the thing is, for 2 whole slots and a 70 faith requirement, by the time that you actually get this in the game, like why isn't this so much better? Like this should easily be lasting over a minute, and the range should not be this small. Like it should be covering half the boss room. Like I don't have to stand next to it every single time just to benefit. Like let me just freely fight the boss and also benefit of this really expensive spell. Like please, it's an end game spell. Let it be good. 105 Gurang's Beast Claw, which this is a slashing damaging based AoE attack that is somewhat comparable to Beast Claw. Beast Claw is not going to go travel in a 360-degree radius, but it actually does travel a bit further and also can be fully charged. So alongside things like the Godfrey's Icon, it actually can do more damage than Gurang's Beast Claw for half the FP cost and a lot less stamina cost. I don't know why this spell consumes as much stamina as it does, but it definitely should not. It also should be getting some types of hyper armor too, and this probably does more damage in general. Immutable Shield, which is obviously a shield-based buff, does improve your elemental guarded damage negation and your damage negation against status effects upon blocking, which already is somewhat niche, but the fact that it only lasts 30 seconds, does have an intelligence and faith requirement, is going to make it even more niche, and have it to compete with things like Barricade Shield and Scholar Shield, it's just not going to be that useful. 103 Bestial Constitution. This spell actually does negate the status buildup of things like Bleed and Frost, which I don't really know in which instances that you really want to use something like this. Honestly, I just let myself just get procced with it, and if I wanted to actually remove it, I would just use some boluses because it is going to be much more consistent, but at least this one can be used infinitely. Number 102, Lord's Aid, which this spell does heal the status effects of poison, blood loss, and sleep. Now the thing is, there aren't really many circumstances to where you really want to use a spell to stop yourself from getting procced with these statuses, and even then, some of them aren't going to really be that high damaging, but at least it can heal you and your allies for pretty cheap. 101 Whirl O Flame, which is a fire projectile attack that does go deceptively far, and if enemies are standing at that certain distance, they can get hit by the entire flame attack and take a decent amount of damage. Now the thing is, there is no tracking at all, so against enemies that are more mobile, you're just gonna miss, and if enemies are at closer ranges, you're not gonna be hitting with that full effect of the flame, and the damage isn't gonna be that great. But for only 13 faith requirements, it can be a pretty decent early game option, but it's probably gonna be outclassed by other different types of fire skills or fire spells that you can get later in the game. Number 100, Honed Bolt. Now this is a lightning-based projectile attack that's going to be more so for PvP due to how fast that it does come out, but in PvE, the damage isn't really quite there, the stack up potential isn't there, and you're only really going to benefit when you just fire out a whole bunch of successive attacks, which against some types of bosses in this game, you're not going to really be having that long of an opening, but it is like basically an instant projectile attack. Enemies aren't really going to be dodging it like that, but I think things like Lightning Strike could just potentially outclass it because it is the exact same animation, but it shoots out a whole bunch more lightning strikes instead that could just do way more damage. Number 99, Wrath from Afar, which is a holy-based projectile attack, does result in an AoE explosion, can go pretty far. The damage itself is not that good by any means, but the whole purpose is to like knock enemies and send them flying. So potentially if you are like going to be in fights with a summon, you can just keep spamming this over and over again and just knock enemies down to the ground. If enemies are next to a ledge, you could just ledge kill them, but that's basically going to be its only use. Number 98, Aspect of the Crucible Thorns. Now this is a piercing, damaging AoE attack that only consumes 14 FP, and if you actually land the entire combo fully charged, you actually can output a decent amount of damage. Now the thing is, you're only going to be doing respectable damage at closer ranges, to where when you have this somewhat of a longer animation, you're probably not going to be winning that trade, because even then the damage is not going to be that amazing, even if you do land a whole bunch of counter hits. You actually do get a bit lower to the ground, so sometimes attacks could just go directly over your head, but the fact that you don't really get that good at tracking, and if enemies are even the slightest bit further away from you, you're just going to be doing awful damage, make me just not really want to use it at all. Number 97, Heal. Now this is a spell that heals you, and it's good to get when you have access to it, and you can eventually switch to it once you get to the other ones that heal you for more. 96, Black Flame Ritual. Now this is the first of the Black Flame incantations we're going to be touching on, and this one I consider to be the least useful, as it does result in you just summoning this little bit of an AoE attack, and the whole purpose is to just have enemies just walk in towards it so they can just take a little bit of damage over time, as you're just going to be hitting them with your other different types of spells or weapons or what's not. So if the entire purpose is just to be meant so enemies could walk in towards it, it's already going to be somewhat niche, because sometimes enemies just don't walk in towards it, and it actually summons a little bit of a ring. So sometimes enemies can just stand in the middle of it and it's not take any damage at all. And also, you could just use like a damaging based projectile attack that could just end up doing more damage. Things like Scouring Black Flame or regular Black Flame fully charged could just do more damage in one hit than the entire Black Flame ritual can actually do. 95, Wrath of Gold, which this is a wholly damaging AoE attack, does come out really fast, can do respectable damage, send enemies flying to the ground. You can fully charge it as well to make it do even more damage. It actually is a really respectable spell, especially because that most holy based spells tend to be projectile attacks, so having a close range spell is obviously going to be pretty useful. Now the downside is that it consumes 40 FP, which is just way too high. Like that is just ridiculously high for how much damage that it does do. It should be consuming like 20 FP, and if that was the case, I would easily put this thing into like a high A tier. Like it's really that good, but for 40 FP, no. Number 94, Assassin's Approach. Now this spell does involve your player character having their footsteps be silenced, and it does negate fall damage as well. Now in the previous games, obviously this was a bit useful, but fall damage in this game is already extremely forgiving, so that portion of the spell is pretty much useless. And in terms of the silencing footsteps, it can be nice, but there are plenty of different types of stealth-based options in this game as it pertains to skills or talismans that it is going to work a lot better than this, but this one does have some pretty low requirements, so it does have a use. Aspect of the Crucible Bloom. Now this thing honestly isn't a big pile of dog shit as you might think. I actually did a playthrough only using the Crucible spells somewhat recently, and Crucible Bloom actually killed a bunch of DLC bosses for me. In fact, I actually killed Consort Radahn only using this spell, so it's not entirely trash. Now the entire purpose of the spell is to be like this ranged based AoE attack, does do holy damage, so against some larger types of bosses that are weaker to holy damage, you could lead off the fight with something like this, because if all the pillars hit, you can do some respectable damage. You also can use it locked off, and the AoE will spawn directly over you, so enemies can just like walk in towards it, and it could do some damage that way as well. But it still is going to be like a worse version of Rain of Fire, because that one can do more damage as it can get fully charged, and it does have a seal to help boost the damage as well. So this thing is only only meant for those bosses that are weaker to holy damage, and also it is against everything else, it's just not worth it because the whole pillars do have a lot of RNG and a lot of cases that it's going to miss, and it does have a long animation, so it's not really worth it in almost every single instance of the game, but there are some circumstances to where you can find some uses. Number 92, Black Flame Blade. This is a weapon buff that just adds some Black Flame onto your weapon. Now the fire damaging portion is not going to be that high, but it does actually add a Black Flame damage over time effect, which does equate to roughly 2% damage over a couple of seconds. So if enemies have really large amounts of health, this thing can just straight up just shred through every single one of them. Now unfortunately, specifically in the DLC area, this effect is just cut in half, so it's going to be a lot less useful for the DLC. And also, the spell only lasts 7 seconds, which I'm just not going to care for. It does have a relatively quicker animation in terms of casting, but having it only last 7 seconds means that you're probably consuming a lot of FP, and it's going to be very inconvenient in terms of your time as well. 91, Land of Shadow. Now this spell does double down as a holy based AoE and projectile attack, kind of similar to Golden Land. Probably not going to be as good because Golden Land does go further and travels a bit faster. The travel speed of Land of Shadow is pretty slow. And in terms of the AoE, it can do okay amounts of damage. The fact that you can get a nice 2-for-1 is pretty cool, but there are going to be better AoE spells out there, and there are going to be better projectile spells out there, and you can get lots of different spell slots in this game, and I'd much rather just use those spell slots just to have those different types of coverages and actually do a lot more damage. Number 90, Blood Boon. Now this is a Blood Flame based spell, and just like all the Blood Flame spells, they're not going to actually scale off Arcane as they're just going to do a flat amount of bleed over time. And for a Blood Boon, it can do an okay amount of damage. I think the best use for it is just like throwing it at the ground of an enemy and have them standing on top of it, and then hope that it will take some bleed build up over time. And it can proc bleed pretty quickly on some types of enemies, but it is only roughly 100 to 150 bleed build up. And when some bosses tend to have like 300 to 400 resist and bleed, it's going to take multiple different casts, and at that point, I'd rather just use a lot of different other spells that can just do way more damage. Number 89, Dragon Bolt Blessing. This is a body buff that does slightly improve your status effect resistances, but it also does make you take more lightning damage. But the best part about it is that it does give you tier 2 hardness. Therefore, you get a bunch of poise and hyper armor, and some enemy attacks can like deflect off you. Now, it is just going to be for smaller enemies, so when you are fighting like these smaller trash mobs and soldiers, if you get surrounded by a whole bunch of them, it probably has some uses there. But for the most part, with how large some of the bosses and enemies can be in this game, this type of buff is going to be borderline useless, especially because there are different types of body buffs out there that can just perform much better in terms of damage negation or just more damage. Number 88, Darkness, to which this is somewhat of an underrated spell. It does summon this darkness cloud to when enemies stand inside of it, they do lose aggro, and when enemies are not aggroed, they do take roughly 20% more damage on the next hit, and also you can just freely open up your map and teleport away if you wanted to. So in any single instance to where you're getting surrounded by a whole bunch of trash mobs, or if you find like a really particular hard enemy, you can just go ahead and use this spell to potentially reposition, or maybe just charge up your really powerful spell or a skill and end up doing a whole bunch of damage to them. So it is pretty cool to have in some circumstances, but it still is somewhat situational. 87, Magma Breath. This is one of the dragon-based spells, and all the dragon breath spells can be really good. Now this one obviously works a lot different than the other ones, because the other ones tend to go really far, but this one's going to be more of a close range type of spell, but have like somewhat of a similar length and animation, so automatically it's going to make it a bit more niche. But the total overall damage, especially when you use the follow-up attack, can be pretty powerful, but for the most part, it is just going to be outclassed by Theodorix's Magma, which you do get a bit later in the game, but that one can just do like up to 50% more damage, and also does have like the same casting speed, only a little bit more FP, and you can also use that one on horseback too. Number 86, Bestial Sling, which is a short-range physical attack, kind of like the physical equivalent of Catch Flame. Another thing is it does go a little bit further, but the damage fall-off is really bad to the point where it's only useful at point-blank range. And it can get some decent damage at a closer range, but it's not going to be able to beat out things like Catch Flame. This is going to be infinitely better, as it's just as fast, but just does way more damage for very similar FP cost. I kind of wish this thing had like a bit more uses, like not have a severe damage fall off, or just get some more stance damage, which these are the things that it had way back when before it got severely nerfed, because yeah, unfortunately, not in a good spot right now. Number 85, Baal's Tyranny, which this is a very high damaging AoE attack, does get a pure arcane requirement, which most types of dragon spells will typically also have a faith requirement, so this one actually can be meant for just pure arcane builds, which is nice. Now you get it all the way in the DLC to where you're going to be at a higher level, and in most cases you're probably going to be spec'd into faith anyway, so it does make it a little bit less useful in my opinion, But the AoE itself can be pretty high damaging. It's only really meant to be useful if you are surrounded by a bunch of enemies, because in like 1v1 targets and boss fights, it's not going to beat out things like Dragon Maw, even a bunch of other different types of AoE spells that is going to perform way better, because this thing does have a longer animation. It still is inconsistent, doesn't work with some talismans in the game. Also, if you are like on an inclined angle, sometimes the AoE can just miss with the explosion, and it just doesn't really go that far. Like, for such a long animation and for as much FP cost, you'd think this thing would have like twice as big as an AoE. It definitely feels like it should have felt the niche of just like a really big AoE spell, especially because you get it right at the end of the game. Like, please, let it be good. Number 84, Flame of the Fell God, to which this is a slow-moving, tracking fire-based projectile attack. To when enemies are in close proximity, it is going to result in this big explosion that can do some pretty nice damage. It's a nice way to like lead off an encounter, because in the middle of a boss fight, when they're in the heat of battle, it's not going to be the most useful thing. And even as like an option to like lead off the boss fight or lead off an engagement, it can be cool, but unfortunately, you can only have one up at a time, which is like extremely annoying, because at least when the fire giant uses this spell, he can actually have two up at a time. So I don't know why we can't have multiple big giant balls so we can actually have it track towards the boss or track towards an enemy. That would have been really cool, would have put it a lot higher, but the one thing that it's supposed to do well in doesn't really do it that well. 83 Placidus Axe's Ruin, which is another high damaging dragon based attack, and unfortunately this one actually doesn't get boosted by any types of dragon buffs because the game doesn't recognize it as a dragon communion spell, but the damage can be really good. It does result in his like AoE lightning explosion, and the whole fire based attack can do some nice damage. You can just try and frame it to have like all the fire based pillars go line up to a particular enemy or a particular boss, and if the whole combo hits, it could do really well. Now the thing is, obviously, really long animation, way too many spell slots, and there's really high amounts of FP. Like, it's a really fun and cool spell to use, but in terms of the uses that it does have, with how many enemies that just don't really give you long openings, I'm not going to really value it as much. Now, getting into the B tier, these spells are going to consist of some pretty good stuff. Like, I can't really say many bad things about these spells. It's just that they're probably just not as good as some of the other broken options on this list, or they might still be somewhat niche. But getting in at number 82, we have Flame Cleanse Me, which this spell is probably the best status effect healing spell, as it does heal you from all poison, frost, and most importantly, Scarlet Rot. This is like the only status effect that's really worth trying to counteract, as it does do a whole bunch of damage over time, and this thing can just freely just counteract it. So a lot of different areas where there are Scarlet Rot, you would just have something like this on with basically every single build, because it is very low FP cost and very low requirements. Number 81, Light of Mikola, which this is a very high damaging, holy based AoE attack that does go pretty far. So if you are trying to lead off an engagement against enemies wicked to holy damage, this is going to be one of the best spells to use. But I think that's its only use. Like, if you're not fighting enemies wicked to holy damage, not going to be that good. I don't know why this thing didn't get like way more damage. Like, it's a long animation and you get it right at the end of the game with the final boss in the DLC. Like, please, once again, why aren't these end game spells the best spells in the entire game? Like, there's no reason for them not to be. Number 80, Divine Beast Tornado, to which this is a physical damaging AoE projectile attack that can do some nice damage. The starting up animation can stun lock some smaller enemies, but it's only enemies like soldiers, so stuff like knights or omens don't get stun locked, to which I would have found it a lot more useful if it did do that. You can fully charge it and actually make it go a lot further and have enemies get tossed up into the air. So all these different types of trash mobs, this could be one of the best AoE spells to use, especially if you have things like the Godfrey's Icon or the Enraged Divine Beast Talisman equipped. It also can hit the same enemy twice as well if you actually stand at a certain distance, because it actually does have that hitbox linger at that distance. So depending on your spacing, this could just do like twice as much damage, which obviously is really good. Mainly they're going to happen more so against larger types of bosses, but if you are going to fight larger types of bosses, things like Pest Thread Spears are probably just going to outclass this, but this actually does double down as a nice AoE or ad clearing spell, as well as potentially a decent boss damaging spell too. Number 79, Bestial Vitality, which is the earliest health regen spell that you can acquire. It does actually regen 5 HP per second for 120 seconds for a total of 600 HP, which early on in the game, to when you actually can get this, it is going to be pretty useful. 600 HP, just having constant health regen for a very low faith requirement, you can't really go wrong. Now, once you get later into the game, it's obviously not going to be as useful, as like even just random trash mobs can hit you for this more than 600 HP, and it's getting like a little bit of HP over 2 minutes is not going to be the best thing in the world. But you can very well just slap it onto any type of build, because it does have a very low faith requirement, and health regen spells basically stack with everything else too. Number 78, Golden Arcs, to which this is a medium-range holy projectile attack that can do an okay amount of damage. It does it like a slow-moving projectile, and in terms of its DPS, is not going to be the best option. If you're going to compare it to things like Multi-Layered Ring of Light or Discus of Light, I'm going to prefer those a lot more as a holy projectile option. But this thing actually does have the use of doing some pretty decent stance damage. Every single hit is going to be 5 stance damage, so with this 3-hit combo, you're going to be doing 15 stance damage, which is just as much as the Stoner Garank, and this one actually can be spammed faster. Now, unfortunately, the fully charged version doesn't increase the stance damage. I wish it did, probably would have given it some more uses, but yeah, for the most part, I'm not going to value it as much as some of the other holy-based projectiles. Number 77, Ghost Flame Breath, which is a magic frost damaging dragon breath spell, which unfortunately it's going to have to compete with things like Dragon Ice and Glintstone Breath, and this thing actually gets in between those two in terms of damage, but it's not going to proc frost anywhere near as fast as things like Borealis' Mist or Dragon Ice can, so it's kind of like this weird in between, and the fact that you get it all the way in the DLC and has the same animation as like the more expensive dragon based spells, I'm probably not going to value it as much, because if I want to use a spell to proc frost, I want to be able to proc frost quickly, and something like Dragon Ice can proc frost literally 3 times as fast, so I think this one is just completely outclassed. Number 76, Triple Rings of Light, which is another holy based projectile attack. This one can go pretty far, does actually fire out at a nice horizontal spread, so fighting enemies like to dodge or move around can actually do pretty well against them. You also can just throw it at the ground and use things like Golden Retaliation to deflect it, or just have it return to you and also just use Golden Retaliation. So there's some nice synergy there. It can be a pretty decent damaging spell. Now the thing is, I'm not going to prefer it over things like Discus of Light, despite this one actually doing more damage, but Discus of Light travels faster, goes a lot further, and is going to be way more efficient. Discus of Light is only 3 FP per cast, where this thing is 23 FP per cast, and also just having higher requirements in both Intelligence and Faith is also going to turn me off, but there are some uses there, and if you do have large amounts of FP with an Int Faith build, you might as well probably use something like this. Number 75, Lord's Heal, which is one of the best healing-based spells in the game in terms of how much health that it actually can give you. Now, the thing is, by the time they actually get it in the game, it's not too far off from stuff like Erdtree Heal, especially based on the amount of requirements and FP cost, but there is like a good chunk of the game where you would like to use something like this, but also once you get a bit later on, things like Heal from Afar are going to heal for basically just as much, but for less FP in a faster animation, so it is just going to be eventually outclassed in multiple different areas. Number 74, Swarm of Flies, which this is a tracking projectile attack, does do physical damage upon landing on an enemy, which is not going to really be doing that much, but the thing is, it does a whole bunch of bleed build-up, which it can get roughly over 500 to 600 bleed build-up, which is way more than enough to proc bleed on almost every single boss in the game. Now the thing is, it does involve enemies having to stay in the AoE, so if they're a bit fast and a bit mobile, you're not going to be hitting with it, and it's also bugged to where if you actually hit with certain parts of the projectile attack and proc bleed with that certain part of the projectile, it's just going to eat the bleed and not do any damage for some reason, and worst of all yet, it's going to reset the bleed, make them more resist, and it's not going to be like no bleed effect, so you're not going to benefit off things like the Lord of Blood Excitation at the very least, and you're just going to be doing no damage, and it happens like at least 30% of the time. I don't know why it's the case, it's been bugged for a long time. If they get that fixed, it would easily be a high A tier, but the way it is right now, it's kind of more of a downside because it's going to make enemies just more resist for free. Number 73, Noble Presence, which is one of the more fun spells to use in my opinion. It is like some cool belly thrusting black flame attack that actually can stagger pretty well. When you have it fully charged, it like sends smaller enemies flying up into the air, and you can just continuously stun lock them, all while doing this black flame damage over time effect, which is really cool. Now the thing is, it doesn't get any hyper armor, and it's a close range attack that doesn't really do that good of damage. Things like Scouring, Black Flame, even regular Black Flame could just do more damage, and they're going to be projectile attacks. So once again, its only use is going to be against those smaller enemies, because you can just very well cheese every single one of them. If it had a bit more damage and a bit more hyper armor, I would have put it into the A tier, but as it stands right now, it still is a little bit lacking. Number 72, Furious Blade of Ansbach, which is a close-range blood flame attack that actually has a really cool animation, can actually stunlock enemies. You can fully charge it to just make it lunge even further and do a whole bunch of bleed build-up. Like the entire combo can very well do almost 240 bleed, which is actually really good, so only using it a few times, you can definitely proc bleed on almost every single boss in the game in only a couple of hits. Now the thing is, the damage itself is not going to be that good. One thing that this spell would have benefited off is a seal to actually help boost the damage. I don't know why there wasn't some cool like blood flame type of seal in the DLC to just give these spells like 15% more damage. That would have been pretty cool, but as for the most part, I kind of consider this one to be a bit outclassed by things like Blood Flame Talons, because that one can just output much higher DPS, and probably just proc bleed faster too, due to its faster animation, but this spell actually can lunge in further, so in certain types of instances to where you probably want to be at a safer distance, you probably want to use this spell instead, but it's still going to be pretty niche. Number 71, Order's Blade, which is a holy weapon buff. Now, the thing is, it actually has an intelligence and a faith requirement. And the thing is, weapon buffs for incantations, they only scale of faith. So this requirement in intelligence is practically just useless and just a big waste of points. Now, it still is a holy damaging buff that can actually give you some nice returns in terms of this damage. Now, it's not going to be better than Electrify Armament because that one is a pure faith requirement and lightning damage is just better than holy damage. But there are some instances to where you would rather have a holy buff, like things like the Great Club, because you don't want to be doing more than 2 different types of damage. And also with the new Black Steel weapons in the DLC, these also get an added bonus in terms of just more physical damage when you do just add Order's Blade buff onto it or other different types of buffs. So there is some uses for it, but I'm still not going to like it more than Electrify Armament with most types of builds. Number 70, O-Flame, which is a high damaging short range fire attack. Now the thing is, this thing can perform just as well as almost any other spell in the game, but it's not going to get any higher because Catch Flame exists, and Catch Flame is just the better version of this in my opinion, as that one can just output much higher DPS and just be a lot faster. Now O-Flame can do more damage per hit and actually can stagger enemies better because Catch Flame doesn't really stagger anything, but in that instance I'd rather have things like Blood Flame Talons because that one, although not going to be as much damage, it's going to serve the purpose of just having some close range fire based attack that can stun lock very well, and also that one's just going to do some bleed build up, so I think that one's just going to also outclass O-Flame, but it still is an amazing spell. 69, Ancient Dragon's Lightning Spear, which is a short-range red lightning attack. It does serve as like a somewhat of an AoE as well. It actually can be really good, get some nice hype drama. It can actually trade out with a whole bunch of these smaller types of enemies. It actually can make you airborne, so you can go jump over certain types of attacks. Now the thing is, there are like 3 other spells that kind of work this way, and I'm probably going to like those ones a bit more. You can get this one a bit earlier in the game, so it does serve its uses there, but once you get access to things like Fortisax's Lightning Spear, and potentially even Lazax's Glaive, I'm probably just going to like those more because I have a bit more going for them, but this is not a bad spell. Number 68, Giant Golden Arc, which this, just like I talked about with regular Golden Arcs, is a slow-paced, medium-range holy projectile. Now, it's not going to output as much DPS nor as much stance damage as regular Golden Arcs, but this one actually does fire off in a nice horizontal spread, so if you're trying to hit multiple enemies at once, or enemies like to move and dodge around, this one actually can be pretty good. Now, despite it not getting as much damage, I'm still going to prefer it a bit more because there is like somewhat of a lack of AoE options when it does come to the incantations, but there definitely isn't a lack when it comes to the single target projectile attacks, so I think it has more of a use because of that. Number 67, Beast Claw, which is a slashing projectile attack, does go pretty far and is extremely efficient. Only 10 FP for how much damage that it does do is definitely worth it. It can hit multiple enemies at once in a nice horizontal spread. You can fully charge it to make it do even more damage, and you can also use this spell on horseback. Now the total overall damage is not going to be the best thing. There are definitely going to be better and higher damaging projectiles out there, so it might be good as an early game option, but the thing is it requires like 5 or 6 death roots to get off rank. If you could get it a bit earlier in the game, I would easily put it into the A tier, but unfortunately the B tier is as high as it can get. 66, Unendurable Frenzy, which is a fire AoE attack, very comparable to the Flame of Frenzy. This one actually can output higher DPS though, because you can just consistently hold onto it over and over again. Now the thing is, I'm not going to value it as much as the Flame of Frenzy, because this one consumes a lot of FP and has you get stuck in a longer animation. And also the Flame of Frenzy does do a lot more stance damage and can be fully charged, so I'm going to find that one more useful in most circumstances. But if you do have longer openings, you definitely can get plenty of use out of this spell. Number 65, Rain of Fire. Now this spell did get buffed some time ago to be in a relatively decent spot. It is a ranged fire-based AoE attack that can output some nice damage, especially if you do have it fully charged with the Fire Knight seal. Now the thing is, it's not going to outperform things like Burn O-Flame as a fire-based AoE option. That's going to do way more damage, but obviously this one can do it at a distance. So if you are going to fight some enemies where you get the fire damage, or just some larger enemies in general, you can just like lead off the fight with this, and then just go into the boss and just use your other higher damaging types of spells. But outside of that use, I would rather just use Burn O-Flame. 64, Lansax's Glaive. Now, just as I talked about with Ancient Dragon's Lightning Spear, this is going to perform somewhat similar. Ancient Dragon's Lightning Spear actually can do more damage in a somewhat faster animation, but this spell is actually cheaper and can go out a bit further. It actually does summon out this cool blade and make it have like a wider hitbox, so it's better at hitting multiple enemies at once, which I think is going to be its best use, because Ancient Dragon's Lightning Spear is probably outclassed by Fortisax's. Now, the thing is, it's still not going to do that amazing a damage, and I still would rather have Fortisax's, because Lansax's doesn't really go that much further. What would have been really cool is if you could actually fully charge this spell and make the blade go like twice as long and have it cover so much more range. That would have been insane, like a Carrion Grandeur type of thing, or Carrion Sovereignty type of spell. That would have been amazing, but unfortunately, just a slight missed opportunity. Number 63, X-Psych's Decay. Now these rot-based spells are amazing in that they do 30% rot buildup over 90 seconds, which typically Scarlet Rot only does 15% damage over that 90 seconds. Now the thing is with these spells, they did get nerfed a long time ago to where their buildup is nowhere near as good, and it's going to take multiple times to actually be able to proc the Scarlet Rot. So I guess a lot of different bosses, it's not going to be that viable. It's only going to be useful as like a ranged physical option, which already are plenty of different types of physical options out there that you can get with an arcane build that are probably just going to do better than this one. And also if you just wanted to use it to proc Rot, then Rotten Breath I'm probably going to value more because that one's a lot cheaper and does the exact same buildup. Number 62, Protection of the Erdtree. This is a body buff that does boost your damage negation or elemental damage negation by 30%, and that is to every single elemental damage type. Now the thing is, I'm not going to value it more so than a lot of the other different types of elemental damage negation buffs, because those ones can actually just boost one particular element by a whole bunch more, whereas this one is going to be all of them only by a little bit, and there's not many circumstances to where you're going to be fighting bosses that are going to be doing multiple different damage types. Now if you are, you can very well go ahead and throw this one on, but it's just going to make it a bit more situational. I'd rather have the ones that just boost that particular type of element, because they could actually boost them up to 60% more damage, so this thing is going to be a bit more niche. Number 61, Poison Mist. Now this is a very cheap spell that just summons a poison cloud, and when enemies stand inside of it, they're going to take a whole bunch of poison buildup, and in most cases it's going to proc poison in just one cloud. Now the thing is, poison is not that good in this game, as I've been mentioning. It's only roughly 6% damage over that 90 seconds, which is definitely not that good. But the reason why it's still going to get this high, because you can very well just proc poison in an instant, and it still is going to result in some amount of damage. And also, enemies don't get aggroed when they get hit by this poison mist, so there are some bosses out there to where you can just like stealthily move behind them and kill them without having to fight them at all. You could just use this spell, so that's basically the main reason why it gets this high. Number 60, Smaragd's Glintstone Breath. Now, every single one of these dragon breath spells can very well just get into the high A tier or high S tier, but obviously this list is based on how useful it is, and I'm not going to really find much value in this one. Now, it actually is going to be the highest damaging out of all the breath-based spells, because for some reason the magic-based versions just out-damage the rest. Now, the thing is, if you use things like Flame Gaming Strength, then the fire-based versions are just going to do better. And also, I would rather have the frost-based ones, because despite them doing less damage, they're going to proc frost really quickly, and if you're procking frost quickly, you're going to be doing more damage than all of the other ones. So I do think that Smaragd's Glintstone Breath is just outclassed by Borealis's Mist. Number 59, Bale's Flame Lightning, which is an extremely high damaging dragon communion spell that has you lunge in and is crashed to the ground in this big attack. Now it's going to be very comparable to things like Dragon Maul. Now the thing is, I'm not going to like it as much as Dragon Maul, because that one can do just as much damage sometimes, especially if you have like those Blue Dancer's charm builds, and it can output more stance damage in a faster animation. And this spell is going to be a lot longer of an animation, do less stance damage, and it's going to be doing 3 different types of damage, mainly physical, then some fire, and a little bit of lightning damage. But the thing is, one thing that I do like it's more so than Dragon Maul is that you can consecutively cast it over and over again. So if you actually do have longer openings, you could very well just spam this spell, and it can output some nice amounts of damage, and it can launch further than Dragon Maul, so it does have some uses. And it also does have better requirements, because Dragon Maul is going to be more so for Faith and Arcane, whereas this one is just pure Arcane. But being that you get it all the way in the DLC, more likely than not, you're going to be spec'd into a little bit of Faith anyway with an Arcane build. So it does have some uses, but I still think it's outclassed. Number 58, Radagon's Ring of Light, which is honestly an amazing AoE spell. This thing covers a 360-degree radius, does an okay amount of damage, but you can fully charge this spell, make it go really far, send all these smaller enemies flying, and do some nice damage. Now, unfortunately, the downsides is that this fully charged version does have a long animation, so if you are surrounded by a bunch of enemies, you might get staggered out of it. And also, I think the biggest downside is its really high intelligence requirement. This thing has a 31 intelligence and faith requirement, so it's only meant for those int faith builds. It would have been so much better if these things were just pure faith. I would have found so much more value in this thing. I would have easily put it into the high A tier, but the fact that it's so situational with certain types of builds makes you not really value it. The A tier, this stuff is just all really good. Like, there really isn't much bad you can say about these spells. They're just not broken. 57, Aspect of the Crucible Tail. This is a physical damaging spell that can result in somewhat of an AoE, as it does result in the tail just spinning around. You can fully charge it to have it spin twice, and when you do have it fully charged, you can do upwards of 40 stance damage and just send enemies flying as well. So it can be pretty good if you're fighting enemies like Knights or Omens, because you do get a whole bunch of hyper armor. But the thing is, I don't really value it much when it's not fully charged. And when you do have it fully charged, it is going to be a longer animation, and against a lot of the bosses, especially towards later in the game, that give you shorter openings, you're going to find less use with this. Number 56, Glintstone Breath. Now, as I mentioned with the Smaragd's Glintstone Breath, these magic-based breath attacks actually can outdamage all the other ones, but I'm still not going to value it more so than things like Dragon Ice or Borealis' Mist, because those ones also do magic damage for the same amount of FP, but can proc Frost really quickly, and if you're proccing Frost on an enemy, you're going to be doing way more damage than you would with this type of spell, so I do consider it to be a bit outclassed, but being that it is the highest damaging one, it's still deserving to be this high. 55, a Blessing of the Erdtree. Now, this is the best health regen spell based on how much HP it gives in 12 HP per second for 90 seconds to you and your allies that are nearby. Now, the thing is, it's still not going to be that much. It's only 1,000 HP over those 90 seconds, and some enemies towards the end of the game can just hit for that amount in just one hit. But the thing is with health regen spells is that they stack with everything, so you might as well just throw it on, because why not? 54, Frozen Lightning Spear, which is a range-based AoE attack that obviously does some Frost Lightning. Now, the Frost buildup is not that high. It's only at 120, so it's going to take like multiple different Frozen Lightning Spears just to be able to proc Frost on a boss sometimes, and that's going to be like its major benefits. A lot of other different types of lightning spells are just going to outdamage this, but this actually can go out pretty far, and it can hit enemies multiple times, so I do think this is like a good alternative until you actually get Ancient Dagger's Lightning Strike, because you can get this one a bit earlier in the game. But once you do get access to Ancient Dagger's Lightning Strike, I'm not going to really find much of a use for it, especially because even as a close range option, it's not going to really do that well, as it's a bit inconsistent. And the area of effect, it doesn't really go out as wide as things like Ancient Dagger's Lightning Strike too. 53, Blessings Boon. Now, as I mentioned with Blessing of the Erdtree, this one is going to be another health regen spell. Now, it's not going to heal you for as much. This is only 8 HP per second for 90 seconds, but the reason why I'm still going to value it more is because it only has a 25 faith requirement. Things like Arcane Faith builds are pretty popular, Strength Faith builds, Int Faith builds. You're only going to be spec'd into a little bit of Faith in most cases, and in that instance, you just be using things like Blessings Boon, because at 25 Faith, you can use this spell and also gain access to things like Golden Vow. And you're going to be using a seal that doesn't really get that good of a faith scaling. And when you're using these non-faith scaling seals, these normal health-based spells aren't going to really benefit as much. But these health regen spells are only going to be a flat amount. So it doesn't matter what your faith scaling is or how much faith that you have. It's not going to get any lower or higher. 54, Lightning Strike. Now, this is a pretty underrated lightning-based spell. Has the same animation as Honed Bolt, but it actually does shoot out a bunch of these lightning strikes. It's very similar to something like Frozen Lightning Spear, is that it can go out pretty far, and it can hit these larger bosses multiple times. So it is a nice alternative to Ancient Dagger's Lightning Strike until you can get there. It's going to be very cheap, it's going to be easy to use, very quick to spam. So it's nice to have, but yeah, once you get access to Ancient Dagger's Lightning Strike, there's not going to be much of a reason to use this spell. Number 51, Great Heal. Now, out of all the healing spells, this one can be one of the most efficient ones to use. It can heal you for a whole bunch of HP, and if you're like around about like 40 to 50% health, you can go ahead and use this, and it's heal basically the rest of your health bar, doesn't matter how much vigor that you have, and it's obviously going to do it a lot cheaper than the other ones, but the thing is, it's not going to heal for as much as stuff like Erdtree Heal or Lord Heal or even Heal from Afar, and those ones, if you just have a little bit more mind, that is going to be much more worthwhile. Number 50 is Stone of Geraint, which this is a physical damaging projectile attack that you can consecutively spam over and over again, output some nice damage. The stagger potential is high, does output 15 stance damage per attack as well, which is really good, especially for how quickly you can spam this thing. Now, there are going to be a few downsides. One, it doesn't get any striking damage, and as a physical damaging option, it still might get outclassed by things like Pest Thread Spears, but you obviously can get this a bit earlier in the game. And also the stamina cost is just way too high in my opinion. With like most stamina bars, you're only going to be able to use this spell like 3-4 times max until you actually run out. And also there's just no hyper armor, and the initial starting animation can be a bit long, and with the fact that this doesn't really go that far, and the travel speed of this projectile itself isn't that fast either, I would have liked for it to have a bit more hyper armor. So despite it still being a pretty decent spell, it kind of lacks it a little bit in my opinion. Number 49, Aspect of the Crucible Horns. Now, I think this one is the best out of all the Crucible incantations in my opinion, because it does result you in just closing the gap really quickly, doing some decent stance damage, and also sending these smaller enemies flying, which I think is going to be its best use. I wouldn't really care for it to use it against bosses that can't be staggered, but you still very well can because it can lunge in far, so it might be a pretty risk-free type of spell. Unfortunately, it doesn't get any piercing damage, and I think with all the Crucible spells, they kind of just lack damage in general. Even if you have things like the Crucible armor equipped, they just still lack a bunch of damage. It would have been cool if there was also like a seal to help boost the damage on top of this, but yeah, even with all the different buffs, and even if you do have it fully charged, it still feels like it's kind of lacking. Number 48, Blood Flame Talons. Now, this is probably the best Blood Flame spell in my opinion, in that it does result in this nice stun lock potential, does do roughly 100 bleed build-up every single hit, and it can output some nice damage. Now, it's not going to be as much as things like O-Flame can, this one can be consecutively casted and going to be a lot faster and potentially have just as much DPS as things like O-Flame can. Unfortunately, it's not going to be able to be fully charged like that one, but the fact that it does just get added bleed on top of it makes it pretty good. I kind of wish I had a bit of hyper armor because the initial casting speed can be a bit slow and it takes a bit for it to actually come out. And still, if you do want to have a close range fire-based option, Catch Flame is still going to just outperform this. It's just going to get much higher DPS. But if you actually wanted to have a spell that can stagger better and potentially proc bleed, I think this is the one. Number 47, Black Flames Protection. Now this is a body buff that does increase your physical damage negation by 35% and does last 70 seconds, so it can be one of the best body buffs in the entire game. Now unfortunately it does actually have the downside of reducing your healing by 20%, which is definitely an unfortunate downside because a lot of the other damage negation spells, basically all of them, don't really have a downside at all. But obviously physical damage is the most relevant damage type in the game, so I guess having this type of negative side effect kind of makes a bit of sense. Now the thing is, I probably would rather use things like boiled crabs because those, albeit it's going to be less damage negation, those don't have a penalty and can last basically just as long, and you can buy them for very cheap and use them for every single type of build, whereas this one is very much just for a pure faith build. But if you are like in later New Game Plus, or if you're in like in the DLC and you're just really struggling against certain types of bosses because it is like one-shotting or two-shotting you, then you could very well use something like this and you could definitely benefit. 46, Electrify Armament, which this is the best damaging buff that the faith-based spells have to offer in terms of just boosting your weapon damage, because one, it is lightning damage, which is the best elemental damage type, and it does boost it by a decent amount. Now the thing is, people don't really typically care to use something like this, because for the most part, if you're going to be going with a faith build, you're probably going to be going pure faith and using things like a flame art infusion or a sacred infusion. So there really isn't many uses for something like this unless you have like a split type of build. You probably like a mainly strength build or a dexterity build, and you probably put like about 20 or so points into faith just to meet the requirements for certain types of buffs, this being one of them. So you just like level up your seal and you can just gain a bunch more damage. You can end up gaining like twice as much damage than like a regular grease can for not much faith investment. So it can be pretty cool, but the fact that with a pure faith build is basically useless because you can't buff infused weapons or elemental infused weapons is still not going to get much play. 45, Argheel's Flame, which is a high damaging fire-based dragon breath attack, and just like all the dragon breath attacks, they can just output amazing damage, go really far, bounce off walls, hit multiple enemies. Like they're just amazing in terms of this ad clearing potential. Now when it does come to these more expensive versions, I'm kind of going to prefer them less because they do have a higher faith requirement where you typically want to use these spells with like a pure arcane build, and they're also just not going to be anywhere near as efficient. So if you do have like a smaller health bar, the other ones are going to be way better to have, and those ones can be used on horseback and go a bit further too. So I only really use these more expensive versions once you do get later on in the game, and if you do have like some more amounts of mind, then I would very well just leave Argheel's Flame on because you're just going to be doing a bunch of fire damage in a wide AoE, stack things like Flame Grant Me Strength, and just melt everything. 44, Black Flame. This is just a very basic fire-based projectile attack. Doesn't have like the fastest movement speed. It doesn't have any tracking at all. Doesn't really go that far compared to some other different types of spells, but it just does some nice damage. You can fully charge it, and it also gets a Black Flame damage over time effect, which against these bosses that have really large amounts of health, it can just straight up melt all of them. And you can get this very early on in the game, which I think is going to be its best use, and it can get boosted by the Godslayer seal, which is like one of the best seals to use for like most part of the game, because between like 27 and 69 faith, you're going to be using this seal, and that's a big chunk of the game, and Black Flame can has benefits more so than all the other types of like regular fire-based projectiles that you can use. 43 through number 40, we're going to talk about all of the elemental damage negation spells. Now, specifically, I'm going to talk about the more expensive ones, the ones that do give you a 60% elemental damage negation boost, which is honestly just amazing. Any single time you're fighting a boss that does a particular element, you can just use one of these spells, and the entire experience is just going to be really easy. Now, obviously, this is just going to be meant for a faith-based build because they typically have around about a 27 faith requirement. Now, for the most part, enemies are mainly going to be doing physical damage, so the elemental ones are going to be a bit more situational, so maybe you would rather have things like boiled crabs on at all times, but for those particular bosses that are doing those really high damaging attacks, then these ones are just going to be amazing to use. Number 39, Heal from Afar, which is obviously a heal that you can throw out to allies. Now, the thing is you can't lock onto allies, so a lot of the times you're just going to be missing, and this spell is literally better to use on yourself more so than actually using it for the allies. And in fact, the other ones are probably better for the allies because they typically have a wider AoE. But Heal from Afar, the reason why it's good for using it on yourself is because it has a faster animation more so than all of the other healing spells. And combined with the fact that it heals you for just as much as Lord's heal, all while consuming less FP and having a lower requirement, it's going to be really good. Now, the fact that you get it all the way in the DLC is going to be a downside, because in the DLC, you're typically going to be at a higher level and just have higher amounts of mind and higher amounts of faith, and things like Tree Heal are just going to heal you for way more and potentially just heal your allies better too. So albeit I do consider it to be a bit outclassed, the fact that it is faster and can still heal you for a decent amount is definitely deserving of an A tier. Number 38, Pest Threads, which is a physical damaging projectile attack that has some nice tracking and honestly does pretty awful damage against most enemies, specifically the smaller ones, because it doesn't really hit them that hard and it also doesn't really stagger them that well either. But against these larger bosses, it's an absolute godsend as it can hit them multiple times, and against these dragons, it can just destroy all of them, and it can be amazing to use on horseback too, due to how good the tracking actually is. So any single time that you're going to be using a build with a faith build and you're struggling against these larger bosses, you can very well to slap something like this on. Now, yes, Pest Thread Spears in the DLC is going to directly outclass it, as it is just a better version. You can fully charge it, more damage, but Pest Threads does actually have the use of being a lot cheaper in terms of its requirements. It's only 11 faith requirements, so you can use this with like an intelligent faith-based build. You can use this with like a pure strength build with a claw mark seal, and benefit of using Pest Threads, and every single one of these larger bosses are going to be toast. But yes, once you do get to the DLC and you have the faith requirements, then Pest Thread Spears is the better option. Number 37, Multi-Layered Ring of Light, which is a wholly damaging projectile attack, kind of meant for single targets. It can go pretty far, can stagger enemies pretty well. When you have it fully charged, it can potentially stun lock, as when it does land on the enemy, it continuously spins around for some nice damage. Now, if enemies like to move and dodge around, it might not be the best thing, because you're not going to benefit of that entire combo. And also, this spell has to compete with Discus of Light, where Discus of Light can be spammed a lot more for only 3 FP and go further, so I'm probably just going to value that one a bit more. But Multi-Layered Ring of Light doesn't actually have an intelligence requirement like Discus of Light, and it actually does have some better stagger potential. So against some types of enemies, you'd probably rather have this particular spell, but in most cases, I'd rather just go for Discus of Light still. 36, Roar of Regalia, which is definitely a very underrated spell in this game. This thing actually received a buff some time ago to make it one of the best AoE options in my opinion. This thing, when you have it fully charged, can stun lock a whole bunch of smaller trash mobs and send them all flying too. You can also use it on horseback, only consumes 17 FP and only has a 14 faith requirement, so you can use it with multiple different types of builds. It might be still lacking in the damage department, especially when uncharged, but when you have all the different buffs like the Roar Medallion, Godfrey's Icon, and the Pelt of Ralva, this thing could be a very solid option, goes deceptively far. But yeah, the best part about it is going to be its crowd control potential. If you're just going through like legacy dungeons, or if you're in a room surrounded by trash mobs, you can use this thing and very well just clear them all out. Number 35, Rotten Breath. Now, just as I talked about with X Sykes Decay, this is a Scarlet Rot Dragon Breath attack. Now, the thing is, I'm going to prefer the cheaper ones, typically more so because they're going to be more efficient, lower requirements, have a faster animation, go further, and in this instance, they both do the same status buildup as well, which I think is like the best use for these types of spells, because you just want to use it just to be able to proc the Rot, which is going to be a 30% version of Rot, which is amazing. Now, the thing is, it doesn't really do that much buildup. It got nerfed way back when, and it's no longer going to be as viable. You have to use it a few separate times just to be able to proc the Rot, which can be cool if you're fighting these bosses like in New Game +7 and have like really large amounts of health. It can be nice when you have like this pure arcane type of build, I suppose, but for the most part, it's only really going to be useful as like a physical damaging projectile against enemies that are already weaker to Rot. Number 34, Mesmer's Orb, which in my opinion is the most fun spell to use in the entire game. It's just so slick when you jump up and just come crashing to the ground in this cool-ass AoE. The animation is just flawless. You can fully charge it to have the AoE and the explosion just be even bigger and make it do even more damage. And for only 31 FP, it definitely can do a pretty nice job. Also does some pretty decent stance damage. If you're surrounded by a bunch of trash mobs, it can definitely just very well just clear them all out. Now, there is going to be a couple of downsides. One, 60 faith requirements. Pretty high, but you get it in a DLC, so it's not that big of a downside. Does take up 2 slots, and worst of all yet, there is no hype rammer. When you're airborne, you can very well just get staggered out of it, and upon landing on the ground, you can get staggered out of that too. If this thing just had more hype rammer, I would honestly put it into the S tier. Would have been really cool. Would have been nice if it only took up 1 slot as well, but it still is a very fun spell to use. 33, Black Blade, a wholly damaging projectile attack that does go really far. You can actually use it multiple times to actually output a lot of damage. It can go through these larger bosses and hit them multiple times, and also does a destined death damage over time effect. So against these bosses with large amounts of health, this thing can just very well just shred all of them. And the fact that it does do holy damage might be a downside, but in the DLC, there are a bunch more bosses that are weaker to this particular element. But unfortunately for the DLC, it is going to be a nerfed version of Destined Death. It's going to be basically half as effective. so that damage over time effect is not going to be as good, but the holy benefits is it's probably going to help negate that. But I think that's going to be its only use is against these larger bosses with large amounts of health, because otherwise I think it's going to be a bit too expensive and a bit too risky to want me to use it against most other different types of enemies. 32 is Scarlet Aeonia. If you have like a faith-based build, you definitely should have at least one of these Scarlet Rot incantations, because all the Scarlet Rot spells do 30% rot buildup. So literally over 90 seconds, you can do a third of an enemy's health bar just by just using the one spell, just one time. And Scarlet Aeonia, you very well can do that. It's going to do roughly 500 to 600 rot buildup, which is probably more than enough for most bosses to be able to proc with rot, which is honestly amazing. Now the downside is that you get it later in the game, and also a bit later than that, you can get to Rotten Butterflies, which Rotten Butterflies I think is just a better version because it can do more damage, especially against these larger bosses where you probably want to use it against, and also just do like 3 times as much rot buildup too. So even against the most largest of bosses, this thing can proc it in an instant. So it is like a little bit outclassed, and the fact that this thing actually takes up 3 whole slots doesn't make me value it as much either. But the thing is, if you just don't have Rotten Butterflies, then I would just have this on basically all the time. Number 31 through 28, we have the Fortification spells, which these are some body buffs that do boost your elemental damage negation. Now, I did talk about a bunch of them earlier, which are actually the more expensive versions that do give you a bigger boost in damage negation. Those ones are 60%, where these ones are only 35% damage negations. But the reasons why these ones are going to be higher is because every single one of these only has a 10 faith requirement. You can very well use this with every single build. Just pick up like the finger seal, go to 10 faith, and you're going to get 35% damage negation against any single boss that you actually want to use it against. Now, if you do have a faith build, then yes, the other versions are just going to outclass this. And in most cases, as I mentioned earlier, enemies are going to be doing physical damage. So maybe like the physical damage negation spells are probably going to be more useful. But there are plenty of instances to where like these bosses do high amounts of elemental damage to where you want to have something like this on. Number 27, Fortisax's Lightning Spear, which is a short-range AoE attack, very similar to Ancient Dragon's Lightning Spear. This one is just going to be the better version, in my opinion, because it has a second attack. Therefore, it just does more damage. Now, obviously, it does consume more FP and actually have higher requirements to compensate, but I'm still just going to prefer it because the damage that the regular Ancient Dragon's Lightning Spear has kind of is a bit lacking, and I think the damage that this one has definitely feels a lot better. You still get some nice hyper armor. You can like jump over certain types of attacks, so it can be pretty well. Now, am I going to value it more so than things like Ancient Dragon's Lightning Strike as an AoE option? No, that one's going to do like way more damage, but against like these smaller single targets for a bit earlier in the game, it's definitely going to serve a purpose, and it is really fun to use as well. Number 26, Giant's Flame. Take a fire-based projectile that can do amazing damage, result in this big AoE explosion that sends all these smaller enemies flying to the ground, and you can just continuously stun lock them over and over again. Like, it's definitely one of the best fire-based projectiles. Now, the downsides being is that it does take up 2 whole slots and consume 30 FP, which is definitely on the higher end, and I would much rather use things like Flamefall upon them, in my opinion, because that one actually does have a nice horizontal spread, can do amazing damage as well, consume like half the amount of FP, and only take up 1 slot, so it's going to be much more efficient for not that much less damage, but the stun lock potential and the fact that you can just toss all these enemies to the ground definitely makes it very useful. Number 25, Lightning Spear, just a basic lightning projectile that's very easy to use. Like, it doesn't get much more simple than this. It's a pretty quick animation. It travels on a flat line and goes straight towards the enemy and does some nice damage. You can also fully charge it. It's not that expensive, lower requirements. You get it early in the game. Like, it's perfectly fine. Lightning damage is great to have. Now, the thing is, it's still just not going to perform as well as some of the other different types of lightning attacks that you get later in the game. And also, once you get to the DLC, Knight's Lightning Spear is just going to be the much better version. That one just does like way more damage than this one can, which might be one of the things that it does lack in, is going to be a bit of damage. But in terms of ease of use, it doesn't get much better than the Lightning Spear. 24, Dragon Fire, which is a fire-based projectile attack, and as I talked about with Arghill's Flame, this one's going to be the same thing, just a bit cheaper, therefore it's more efficient, can use it on a horseback, can go further, you get it very early on in the game. A lot of enemies earlier on tend to be pretty weak to fire damage too. Like, it's nice to use. Now, I'm still not going to value it as the best Dragon Breath projectile attack, as I think that Dragon Ice just has that one covered, so it's not going to get into the S tier for that reason, but it still is amazing. Number 23, Scouring Black Flame, to what I consider the best Black Flame incantation in my opinion. This one is a nice horizontal spread of a Black Flame attack, can do roughly just as much damage as Black Flame, doesn't go as far though, but still far enough for it to be a decent projectile. Now, the thing is why I'm going to value it a bit more, outside of the fact that it can just hit multiple enemies and probably better at hit detection, but it can just sometimes hit twice. There's like a weird bug going on with it where like some part of the hitbox just can hit multiple times for some reason, and obviously that's going to make it do twice as much damage. And it is actually somewhat consistent. About like 40% of the time you're going to be hitting like multiple times, and it can just be one of the highest damaging things. Alongside this black flame damage over time effect against these larger types of bosses, it can definitely put in a lot of work. Now against the DLC bosses, once again black flame got a bit nerfed, probably going to be less useful there, and they're probably going to value these black flame spells not as much. So that's probably part of the reason why it's going to get a bit slower, and the fact that the double damage is a bit too inconsistent. But if you actually wanted to have somewhat of an AoE spell, you can't go wrong with this one. Number 22, Dragon Claw. All the dragon spells are just amazing, and this is just one of them. It's a physical damaging short-range AoE attack that does actually get follow-up inputs. You can actually have a seal in either hand and keep alternating between the both, and just keep getting a bunch of attacks off, and it can just do amazing damage, really high stance damage. You get a bunch of hype armor. Like, this thing is basically just broken. The only downside is that I would consider it to be a bit outclassed by Dragon Maw, because Dragon Maw can just do more damage in one hit, lunge a bit further, and just do more stance damage too. But if you do have those longer openings, then Dragon Claw honestly can be the better option, because you can just spam it more so than you can with the Dragon Maw. And this one might be better early on as well, because it does have lower requirements. So whether you're going with Dragon Claw or Dragon Maw, it literally doesn't matter. Both of them are just borderline broken. Number 21, Howl of Shibriri, which is the highest damaging body buff in the entire game. Upon using it, you gain 25% more damage for 40 seconds, which is honestly just incredible. And this is to all damage types, all different types of sources, whether it's spells, skills, weapons, doesn't matter what it is, but it does have the trade-off of you taking 30% more damage. So if you're going through the game for the first time or exploring different types of areas, I probably wouldn't bother with this. It's only if you're a bit more comfortable with the game, or if you do have like this insane like one-shotting build already, then yeah, go ahead and use Howl of Shibriri. But for the most part, it's not going to be meant for those casual players. Number 20, the Flame of Frenzy. This is a very high damaging AoE attack that can output some of the highest stance damage out of all the spells in the game. Like, this thing when fully charged can do upwards of 50 stance damage, which is just amazing, especially for only consuming 16 FP, having a 16 faith requirement, and you're getting acquired right at the beginning of the game. Like, you very well should just run straight to the Weeping Peninsula, pick up this spell, and just leave it on for a good chunk of the game. Now, there are going to be a couple of downsides. One, if you're not going to be sitting at those certain distances where the entire AoE hits and enemies are probably like at closer ranges, you're not going to benefit of all that damage. And also, I think the worst part about it is that it does do a bunch of madness build up to yourself, and that's going to be the reason why I'm not going to put it into the S tier, because if you use it like 3 or 4 times, you're probably going to proc madness on yourself, which is something that you just don't want to have, but you still can find plenty of success with a spell like this. Welcome to the S tier. This is probably where the video starts for a lot of people, because some people just don't really care to use the cool stuff and they just want to use the broken stuff. That's perfectly fine. I'm not going to judge. Other people might though. But as number 19, we have Theodorix's Magma, to what I consider the best fire-based dragon spell. Now, it's obviously not going to go as far as things like Arghill's Flame or Dragonfire, but this thing can just output so much ridiculous amounts of damage, it's not even funny. Like, against bosses, especially weak to fire damage, that follow-up attack can just melt them. Like, sometimes even one-shot some bosses too. Like, it's just that good. The only downside is that you do get it a bit later on in the game, and obviously it's not going to go as far as the other types of spells, but if it just comes to single target damage, it's not going to get much better than this. Number 18, Fire Serpent, which yes is not the highest damaging projectile by any means, but this thing is incredibly efficient, and it might be the easiest spell to use in the entire game. You don't have to be close to an enemy. This thing has the most ridiculous tracking. You can fully charge it, and it actually does some decent damage. This thing can be just as expensive as things like Catch Flame, but can actually do more damage, especially if you have things like the Fire Knight seal equipped, and especially if you do fully charge it. Like, it really is just that good of a spell. Like, the only downside is that it's obviously not going to output the highest amount of DPS, as Catch Flame can do that, but purely because of ease of use, this has to get into the S tier. Number 17, Borealis's Mist. Now, as I've been mentioning throughout the entire video about the Dragon Breath spells, I'm gonna value the Frost ones the most, because when you're proccing Frost, not only are you doing a flat percentage of damage, but you're also debuffing them to make them take 20% more damage over 30 seconds, and these Frost spells can actually proc it really quickly and just do it at a really far distance. Like, these Dragon Breath spells are all amazing, and I think these ones are the best amongst them. Now, yes, once again, I don't really like the more expensive versions than the cheaper versions, as those ones are going to be better for most parts of the game due to them being more efficient, having lower requirements, also being able to use on horseback and go a little bit further. But once you do have like higher FP and more room to play with, then yeah, I would just use Borealis's Mist, and this one's probably going to be the Dragon Breath spell that you can use at these higher levels. Number 16, Burn O Flame, which is one of the best AoE spells in the game. This thing just melts so many enemies really quickly against these trash mobs. It can like send them all flying into the air. When you have it fully charged, nothing really stands a chance. Now, there are going to be a couple of downsides. One, the fire-based pillars do have a little bit of like RNG to them. So sometimes you can just output amazing damage. Sometimes it's not going to be as much. Also, you have to be holding onto the spell the entire time just to really benefit. If you get staggered out halfway through, then a lot of the damage is not going to be there. And if you wanted to have like a high damaging AoE attack, Ancient Dagger's Lightning Strike is going to do that for you, but this one actually is more consistent to use at closer ranges, where Ancient Dagger's Lightning Strike is probably better against like larger bosses at a further distance. So there are going to be some uses for both, but yeah, both are still deserving of an S tier. Number 15, Grail's Roar, which is like this single best debuff in the entire game. Upon using this spell, it does do like a little bit of damage. It does like send some enemies flying, but it actually does debuff enemies to make them take 10% more damage and make them deal less damage by 15%. And it lasts 60 seconds. So if you are going to be like a New Game Plus or you're in the DLC and you're fighting these bosses that just do like insane amounts of damage and aren't really taking much damage, you can very well just use Grail's Roar, and for the next minute, it's going to feel like a pretty balanced boss. Number 14, Erdtree Heal, to what I consider the best healing spell in the entire game. This thing can very well just heal your entire FP bar from like 1 HP to max. Doesn't matter how much vigor you have. If you have enough faith, it is going to be the case. Now, yes, does have higher requirements, does consume more FP, so earlier on in the game, not going to be the best option, but you get it later on in the game anyway, to where it's probably balanced around about this level. And also, it's probably going to be one of the best spells to use if you are at really high levels, like 300, 400. You're probably going to have a lot of faith and you're going to have lots of vigor. And probably your healing flask is not going to do it for you, and you're probably just better off just going into a lot of mind and using more FP flasks, because your Erdtree Heal is going to heal you for way more than your regular healing flask can. Number 13, Frenzied Burst, to what I consider the best sniping spell in the entire game. This thing goes ridiculously far and travels in basically an instant. Like, it's not going to really miss anything. It's just that good. So if you actually want to pick up enemies at a distance, or if you are in like a really large boss room, this thing can be one of the best spells to use. Now, if you are in like the heat of battle against enemies that are relatively close to you, not going to be the best thing, because it does have a longer animation and other different types of projectiles could just output higher DPS, but it can be something that you just leave on the entire time, especially because you get it pretty early on in the game, and there are so many circumstances to where this thing could benefit. Number 12, Blood Flame Blade, to what is a weapon buff that does obviously add some fire damage and a little bit of bleed. Now, the fire damage portion, not going to be the best thing. It's only going to add like 50 to 100 fire damage. Doesn't really matter how much faith you have sometimes, but the entire benefit is that it does add a flat 40 bleed buildup, and when you hit an enemy, it's going to do that 40 bleed buildup over a couple of seconds. Now, this thing is extremely useful when you do pair it alongside a weapon that can already be buffed and has bleed. So all these different types of katanas, Scavenger's Curved Sword, this is like the obvious weapon buff to use, because not only can you retain really good damage, but it's get almost twice as much bleed build-up with this spell. And I think best of all yet, it actually bypasses the status effect motion values. Typically when you use these like quicker types of skills, the status effect build-up gets nerfed a little bit, but for Blood Flame Blade, it's a flat amount, and it's always going to do that 40 bleed build-up over those couple of seconds. So you're going to proc bleed way faster with this spell than you otherwise normally would with like a regular bleed infusion or an occult infusion, and using these really quick skills. Number 11, Flame Fall Upon Them, to what I consider the best fire-based projectile in my opinion. This thing actually can go really far, does fire out in a nice horizontal spread, so fighting multiple enemies or enemies like to dodge around, gonna be amazing. And you don't have to hit with every single flame, just the benefit of max damage. You only really have to hit with like a few of these things. Also can be fully charged to make it do even more damage, and only consumes 18 FP. Like, this thing is extremely efficient for how much damage that it actually can do, while also just being really easy to use. Like, when it comes to all like the base game projectile spells, this one might just be the best one. Now, when you do get to the DLC, I think a couple of options might just outclass this. And the fact that you get it a bit later in the game makes me not really want to put it that much higher either. Like, if this thing was like early on, I would easily put this like into the top 5. Like, it is just that good. Number 10, Flame grants me strength, the best body buff in the game. I don't care what anybody says. This thing gives you 20% more physical damage, 20% more fire damage, and 10% more faster stamina recovery speed for 30 seconds. Now, yes, 30 seconds, not the longest time, but it is a pretty quick animation. And best of all yet, it only requires 15 faith. You can use this with basically any build, and you're going to be doing 20% more damage with those builds as well, because in most cases, you're going to be doing physical damage, and you're just going to benefit of faster stamina recovery speed too. Like, there's no reason to just not spec into 15 faith with every single build, because you can just benefit of such an amazing buff. Number 9, Discus of Light, the single most efficient projectile spell in the entire game, and it is not even close. It's a holy base projectile that does go really far in a really quick speed, travels on a flat line, and actually can return to the player character too to just make the spell hit twice. Now obviously in the base game, where enemies tend to be pretty resistant to holy damage, might not be the best projectile to use, but it only consumes 3 FP. 3 FP, that is basically just free. You're gonna spam this thing all the time at any single moment, and you're practically just never gonna run out of FP, and you're just gonna benefit of a decent damaging projectile attack. Number 8, Rotten Butterflies. Any single time that I have a faith build and I have access to the spell, I basically just have it on because yeah, rot's damage in this game is just ridiculous, especially with the spells, as it can do roughly a third of an enemy's health bar over 90 seconds with just this one attack. Now yes, Rotten Butterflies does have like somewhat of a longer animation, but you actually do become airborne, so some attacks can actually go underneath you, and it can bypass grab attacks as well. And if all these butterflies connect, you're actually doing some decent damage and doing like well over 1500 rot build up, which is like more than enough to proc rot on any single boss in the game. So into like later game or new game plus or whatnot, this is just a spell that you just have to use because you can do a third of a boss's health bar with just this one attack. Number 7, Golden Vow, probably the most important incantation in the game. I can very well put this thing at number 1. It definitely is the best buff too, because for 80 seconds, you gain 15% more damage and 10% more damage negation to you and your allies. And best of all yet, it only requires 25 faith, so you can use it very early on. And with all these hybrid types of builds that probably mainly spec into things like strength or arcane, you can just go into a little bit of faith and this benefit of such an amazing buff. Like, it can definitely help trivialize a lot of different bosses, and the fact that it can just work with every single damage type under any single circumstance is just going to be broken. Number 6, Pest Thread Spear is the best physical damaging projectile in the game. Now, as I mentioned with regular Pest Threads, as it does just do more damage with like the exact same insane tracking, therefore it's going to hit all these larger bosses multiple times. You can use it very well on horseback, but yeah, any single like dragon, Elden Beast, Furnace Golem, they're all just going to get destroyed very quickly. Now, unlike Pest Threads, you actually can fully charge this spell to make it do even more damage, and obviously you can pair it alongside the Godfrey's icon too. Now, against like larger bosses, you're probably still better off just like spamming the uncharged version, but this fully charged version is going to be good against like some smaller single targets, where regular Pest Threads probably just sucks. This thing can actually shine there as well. It's really good tracking, and it's still going to do some decent damage. Number 5, Dragon Ice, the single most important Dragon Breath spell in my opinion. Now, I'm not going to get into it again as to why I like all the Dragon Breath spells or why I like the cheaper versions better, but Dragon Ice is just going to be amazing in the fact that you can get it very early on in the game, and it's going to proc Frost really quickly and have really low requirements. You can use this as both an Arcane build and a Faith build. And when you're proccing Frost, you're not only doing a flat 10% damage, but you're also debuffing enemies to make them take 20% more damage over the next 30 seconds. And with how fast this thing actually procs it, this can very well just be the highest damaging Dragon Breath spell in the game. Number 4, Dragon Maul, which is a physical damaging dragon spell that can just like lunge in really far and just do amazing amounts of damage and do like 50 stance damage in just one hit, which is just ridiculous. It also does have like a sweet spot to the spell to just make it do like 50% more damage, which is just absurd. But yeah, all dragon-based builds are just broken because you can just go into Arcane and just benefit of this really good spell damage because of the Dragon Communion Seal, and this seal just boosts all these spells by 20%, and as of the DLC, we have the Rock Heart Transformation to help boost the damage by a further 20%, and this is going to have amazing synergy with the Blue Dancer's Charm, and slapping all these things together with Dragon Maul makes it one of the most broken-ass spells in the entire game, and it's like a must-have for like any Arcane Faith build. Number 3, Night Lightning Spear. This is like the best projectile attack in my opinion out of all the incantations. If you wanted to have like a single target projectile, this is the one to use because not only is it going to be doing the best elemental damage type in lightning damage, but it also is invisible to enemies for some reason. It kind of performs very similar to like the night-based sorceries. It probably because it has the word night in the name, even though it is a different night, but it still works the exact same way, and the enemies are not going to dodge or input read it at all. This thing also can do like over 30 stance damage, which is like twice as much as Stoner Grenk. And when you have this bad boy fully charged alongside all the lightning-based buffs, and as of the DLC, we have the Priestess Heart Transformation, Dragon Cult Seal on the offhand, you're just going to be destroying everything. Number 2, Catch Flame. This spell can very well just like replace all weapons if you wanted to. You could just go with a pure faith build. You get this spell right at the beginning of the game, and it's like a really close range, high DPS machine that doesn't really consume much FP. Like, you'd have to be really close to enemies. It's not going to do like the most amazing stagger damage, not going to do much stance damage at all, but the total DPS for how quick that it actually can be casted is kind of just ridiculous. Like, it definitely is the best fire option. And any single time that you're fighting enemies that give you shorter openings with a faith-based build, you can just use this thing and just fuck up everything. And at number 1, and still the best spell in the entire game, Ancient Dragon's Lightning Strike. Now, just to confirm that this was actually the best spell, I just did a playthrough recently using like the red lightning spells, just to see whether or not I liked Nice Lightning Spear or Ancient Dagger's Lightning Strike better. And yeah, Ancient Dagger's Lightning Strike is still the king. This thing destroys literally everything. Doesn't matter what it is, small, medium, large, any single given day, any type of weather, any moment in time, this thing just fucks. Like, even if you don't have all the buffs, it can still do amazing damage. But with all the buffs equipped, things like Godfrey's Icon, all the lightning buffs, Priestess Heart's transformation, Gravelstone Seal, you're basically like one-shotting every single boss. It is just that good. Now, the downside is it does have somewhat of a longer casting animation, but with how far that it does go, you can charge it up in safety. You could also use things like Endure and then switch to Ancient Dagger's Lightning Strike to just help tank the attacks and just trade out. It can be a bit inconsistent sometimes and a bit RNG heavy with all the different lightning strikes, but that's a very small downside to an otherwise borderline busted ass broken spell. We are done. I don't want to talk about the incantations for a long time now. This is like the second time I'm doing this video. Obviously, one was before the DLC. But next, we're going to touch on the sorceries, which is like roughly 100 of those things. So it's going to be another longer video. But that'll be like the last of all like these long format types of videos until we go back to like smaller ranking types. Probably going to be touching on like the other Souls games as well. We'll see what happens. Anyway, catch you guys around. Bye.